What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 151. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm talking about Afghanistan and all the latest news going on there. But unlike the rest of this week, where it was exclusively Afghan coverage on Conflicts of Interest, I'm also going to be talking about China, Israel, and Iran. So a lot of important stuff on today's show. Be sure you share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show, as well as the daily news roundup that I write for the Institute. You can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey for the video version. Of course, we really prefer people are signing up for one of the alternatives, Odyssey or Rumble, just because the increasing censorship on YouTube probably means our account isn't going to make it there forever. You can also find the show on Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter, and the Twitter handle is @con_interest. My Twitter handle is @KyleAnzalone_. Last, you could support the show by giving us money at Patreon or Subscribestar. There's also information to donate crypto in the show notes page. And you could support the show by getting your CBD products at Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com. The promo code is PEACE, and that gets you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. Of course, all the information is in the show notes page anywhere you could listen to the show, so very easy to find and get yourself to Paloma Verde. Once you're on the website, you'll see that they have a great selection of CBD products, even stuff for your dog. But if you want stuff for you, they got gummies, soft gels, tinctures, and topicals. Really enjoy the topicals. The sports cream is absolutely fantastic. It doesn't take very much to get the pain relief, so the bottle lasts a really long time. And they also have a variety of other products. Will Porter, the typical co-host, really likes their soft gels to help him battle his insomnia. So lots of great reasons to use CBD products, lots of ways it could help you out. Over at Paloma Verde, they got some of the best products and one of the widest varieties of products that I've been able to find. So I really suggest you do your CBD shopping there. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE, PEACE. That does get the show a kickback, and it helps us out as well. But it's a great company with great products. All right, now let's get into the show. First story I have here is about the $1 billion in weapons that have been seized by the Taliban on their offensive across Afghanistan. Now, there hasn't been a thorough accounting anywhere I could find exactly of what the Taliban were able to capture, what's going to be somewhat useful to them, and what is, maybe a nice meme or image, but really isn't anything other than an expensive lawn ornament. So they may be able to operate the Black Hawk helicopters a time or two. They apparently captured an A-29 Super Tornado attack aircraft. I'm not sure if they're ever going to be able to operate this, or if any of the Black Hawks or A-29s that they actually got their hands on were operational and functional. They could have been missing key components, even though from some of the pictures you can see it does look like these are intact. Now, it's pretty clear that the Taliban captured a lot of small arms. We're talking mostly about like M4s and M16s, but also, smaller like anti-armor weapons or maybe surface-to-air weapons, hand grenades, a few others that I couldn't exactly identify. There were some drones that they had captured. Again, I'm not sure if they have all the equipment need to operate more of the advanced weapons. Obviously, with like an M4, all you need is the clip and the bullets, and to be able to pull the trigger. And I'm sure they take the firing pins out of all those things or anything. So I'm sure all of these are actually functional. The Humvees and the mine-resistant vehicles, it seems they did capture a lot of those. There's some video that seemed to show Taliban actually using some of these, so at least some of them appear to be functional. That being said, it's while there's video of them capturing a lot of it, it's still unclear exactly all what was able to be used. Now, on top of all the other weapons, and obviously, the concerns there are pretty clear and resemble, of course, the collapse of the Iraq army, during the ISIS blitzkrieg in like the rise of the Islamic State 2013, 2014, and ISIS was able to put all these weapons to quite a bit of use, especially like the armored vehicles and the Humvees, using them for like suicide attacks on bases. And so there may be a lot of use for the Taliban in these weapons. It may help them to maintain their control over the country. Should other groups try to rise up and overthrow them, it could help them to defeat those type of groups. I'm not sure. Maybe they could sell some of it back to the U.S. Maybe the U.S. will be willing to negotiate for the Super Tornadoes and the Black Hawks, even if it's just like for PR stuff to get that back. Or still kind of surprised the U.S. hasn't targeted it with airstrikes and just blown all that stuff up yet. Now, so again, all those weapons, I think the problems are kind of predictable where they could come, and then too, also just sowing, problems in the region, arms trade in the region, as we're going to see. I'm likely, all the Taliban already have their AKs, and now they're apparently picking up the M4s, and so maybe they're going to leave their AK at home, but maybe they're going to have a whole lot of AKs to sell, and so we could see this maybe fuel insurgencies or rebellions, or different actors, militias, governments, even in other countries. Maybe I would have my eye most like on Pakistan or Kashmir as the regions for those weapons to go. But the weapons I really find, not weapons necessarily, but things that the Taliban capture that I think are really interesting. This is done at the reporting by Ken Kleppenstein at The Intercept. So there's reasons to be skeptical behind all of this. I don't think he is the reporter I would absolutely trust, but there is some evidence that the Taliban did capture these devices and have at least tried to use them. I've seen some of this video, so I'm his claims are his claims, and I'm be very careful to point out what he is saying. But it does seem that the Taliban had captured some of these devices that I believe are called Hind, but they essentially scan biometrics. Now the big question, and Kleppenstein says that the Taliban will have access, is the U.S. has apparently collected data on about 80% of Afghans, their biometric data. This means their iris scans, what their position in the government is, all this kind of stuff. I'm not sure if it has everything down to maybe like phone number and address, but apparently would have like who worked in the Afghan government and what their role was. And so Kleppenstein says they have the access to that information. Now, even then, just with the biometric devices, they could probably put them to nefarious use, or potentially sell them to different states who may be able to put them to better use. So maybe the Taliban don't have they don't have an intelligence agency. They might not have the ability to crack this and find the data, but they could sell it to Pakistan, Iran, China, or a different country that maybe could, access that kind of data. And millions and tens of millions of Afghans have now essentially had their data compromised by the U.S. and are neglect for it. So that part of it is really disturbing to me. Again, they definitely had these devices. Now, how much they could use them and what they'll use them for is still the question. But this just goes to show how poorly the U.S. nation-building effort in Afghanistan has gone, and how we gave all these very advanced weapons to all these, different actors in Afghanistan who obviously didn't really have any interest in maintaining them or protecting them, and have just let them fall into the hands of the people the U.S. was fighting the past 20 years. So very interesting. Just again, a big show of failure for the U.S. nation building effort in Afghanistan. I think that's all I have on the weapons for now. I'll continue to update this, especially the Hind and the biometric data. If we find out that the Taliban are going to be able to access this could be an extraordinary tool if they choose to really carry out a very totalitarian and brutal reign over Afghanistan. Else going on is that the Afghan accounts, the government accounts, are being frozen. First, the U.S., this was reported by the Washington Post, froze the assets that were in the U.S. of the Afghan government. Now, it's unclear of how much money that is. Apparently, in April, the Afghan central bank held $9.4 billion in reserves. Now, of course, 80% of the Afghan budget comes from the U.S., so if a lot of this money is held in the U.S., I wouldn't be surprised. I know that, in the past week or so, they have started to, I'm sure, see cracks in the Afghan government, and so maybe they had looked to get some of the money, some of the cash out of Afghanistan before the Taliban took over. But it's unclear of where all the $9 or so billion of assets the Afghan government should have is. Some of it's in the U.S. clearly, some of it's in their IMF accounts that were also suspended. Now the IMF kind of put this out like, oh, this is a normal thing we do when governments, kind of by this method, not exactly something that's enshrined in the country's tradition for the new group to take over. They do this, but they're saying that there's a lack of clarity surrounding the recognition who's in control of the government, so they suspended the accounts. In one way, this may be a good thing in case like Ghazni or whoever else was a former member of the Afghan government's going on a massive spending spree. However, if the Taliban are looking to like be a government and to have traffic cops and all that, then they're going to have the central bank or something. That's the institution that Afghanistan has to pay their workers. Then cutting off this could be something that makes it very hard for the Taliban to operate their state and could cause a lot of instability in Afghanistan. But it's yet to be seen exactly what's going to happen with this money, but it's something definitely to keep an eye on. We're talking about billions of dollars here, and I'm sure a lot of people who would like to steal it. Interesting meetings going on yesterday in Afghanistan. Well, I guess Wednesday now, for people listening to the show. The former Afghan president Karzai met with Taliban at I believe, the home of Abdullah, who was also there. So it was Karzai, Abdullah, and then the Taliban officials that went to meet with them. This is the, I guess, slight effort that's being made. Essentially, people who are in the Afghan government, but I guess had better relationship with the Taliban than like the president who fled the country, Ashraf Ghani, or maybe people who are involved in the Afghan military before, Karzai, Abdullah, and I believe Hetmachar, all a part of this group that are looking to facilitate some sort of transition to the Taliban. I'm not sure what the Taliban interest in meeting with Karzai is, and if this is just something they're doing to see what the guy has to say and really have no interest in building a deeper relationship, or if they're really going to try to do some kind of transitional government kind of thing. Now, I understand that today, was it August 19th, 2021, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the new name of the country declared by the Taliban. They say it's their Independence Day. I believe they are now waving a white flag that's, got some writing on it. It's not just plain white. And that is apparently what they want to be the new flag of Afghanistan. I guess this makes sense to talk about this right now because I've seen some pictures and videos of what are claimed to be protests going on in Afghanistan opposing the Taliban. The best I could tell is that the people opposing the Taliban are waving a lot of the old red, black, and green flags, whereas the Taliban people are waving like the newer white flags. I'm not sure how many of the actual ones that the Taliban have been like professionally made or how they're doing it, but I have seen some flags that seem to resemble the flag that the Taliban are now using. So that the protests are going on in Afghanistan. There's a lot of reporting from the Western media that these protests are breaking out into conflicts and the Taliban are acting brutally against the protesters. To be honest, it does seem like there are some places where violence has broke out at these protests, although nothing I have seen makes it clear that the Taliban were the instigators and sole proprietors of the violence. There were some cases where it seemed that there were warning shots fired and then people were trampled, and from the position of the Taliban, I'm not, firing warning shots is something that happens by quite a few actors in Afghanistan. So it's not even, I guess, clear to me that the Taliban would have been the actors that fired those shots, but if they were, that they were necessarily, trying to get a bunch of people killed or anything like that. Other videos are surfacing alleging that the Taliban are carrying out reprisal killings. A lot of this stuff to me seems hard to verify. I don't necessarily doubt that to some extent is going on. The the Taliban were victims of war crimes by people in the Afghan government over the past 20 years. And so, not that I'm necessarily endorsing these reprisal killings. However, if they're killing some guy that was the commander of the Afghan army in this province or that province of Afghanistan, it's not quite the same thing as them just pulling some random girl off the street of Kabul and executing her for not having on the appropriate coverings or something like that. Some of this, I think, is just a part of the brutal warfare that's been going on in Afghanistan. So with all that said, then there's the question of what's happening to the Americans in Afghanistan, where this week I've heard people estimate that there's between 10 and 15,000 American citizens or permanent residents of the U.S. that are currently in Afghanistan. It's not at all clear to me that or even a majority of these people are in Kabul, although that would be my guess. I don't know if anybody's actually put out those numbers. I have heard that there are some NGO type groups that are getting flights out of Afghanistan from places other than the Kabul airport. And so just because somebody is, let's say, in Herat or in Kunduz or something like that, and they're looking to get out of Afghanistan, I don't think it necessarily means that they have to get to the Kabul airport to get out of the country. There may be other options, and who knows, that they may be more productive than what the U.S. is trying to do at the Kabul airport. They say they're doing about 20 flights a day on the C-17s, which officially I think could carry like under 200 passengers each. Now I'm not sure if they're breaking those rules and they're loading these things up 600 people deep like they were that one C-17. It would certainly seem to make sense to try to put as many people on these planes as possible. The State Department has said that they are not able to test for COVID on site, and so if you're interested in that, apparently they are not bothering trying to do that. There was a press conference with Secretary of Defense General Lloyd Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Milley. That was Wednesday, I believe, and from that press conference, it didn't sound like there were all the official processes even in place at this point to evacuate Afghans from Afghanistan, including there doesn't seem to be a lot of clarity what they're going to do about the Afghans that do not have passports. And so the entire evacuation part is a mess. Wendy Sherman, who's the Deputy U.S. Secretary of State, did say, again, I believe this is on Wednesday, that the Taliban were allowing U.S. citizens safe passage to get to Kabul Airport. I guess at least if they're in Kabul. I'm not exactly sure if that works for people who are, in other areas of the country. General Austin said that the U.S. couldn't, move into Kabul to extract U.S. citizens or anything like that. They just don't have the assets at this point, is what he's saying. And this is interesting because this is the statement from the U.S. government. However, again, if you watch the mainstream media, particularly CNN today, was reporting that there was no way for U.S. citizens in Kabul to get to the Kabul airport. I saw Jeff Scroll, who writes at Task and Purpose, and usually writes some pretty good stuff. He had put out a tweet with a video saying that he didn't think that people could get to the Kabul airport. And I in fairness, if that video is accurate, he says a friend he knows in Kabul sent it to him, then it seems likely that it would be very hard for an American to get to the Kabul airport, although I'm not exactly sure of how much it's the Taliban really preventing this versus just kind of the chaos at the airport and the many people that are trying to get through the airport. The Taliban are maintaining order, quote unquote, outside the airport. I don't like to say maintaining order like that, but they are, I think, doing warning shots, maybe using whips, or at one point I read a story saying chains to try to contain the mobs trying to get into the airport. Kind of a double-edged sword thing here, though, because if they don't contain the mobs, then the U.S. is going to blame the Taliban for the chaos at the airport and saying that that's why nobody could get out of the country. But then if they, put the mobs under control in the way the Taliban do, some people end up at least very hurt. So the situation again in Kabul and Afghanistan is not great right now. Now, it's not the level of violence that maybe you would expect for the Taliban to be taking over, but at the same time, there does seem to be some conflict going on, some people getting killed, protests going on in various areas of Afghanistan. But in part, I have seen videos too of these protests going on, and the Taliban guys walking around with their machine guns, and they're not opening fire on the crowds, right? Like the U.S. allies in General al-Sisi did in Egypt, or like our allies in Bahrain did. Rather, the Taliban at this point, they're not like just turning their guns onto the crowd or anything like that. And so that's to the best of my ability describing what I could see going on in Afghanistan. Biden said that he's not going to withdraw troops until all Americans are out of the country. If you just look at the pace that they're bringing the people out of the country, the Americans and the Afghans out of the country at this point, I mean, I could see it taking months for them to get everyone out. They are not doing this efficiently at all. And so if Biden is serious about that, then this could push us past the official supposed to be withdrawal date of August 31st, and when we're less than 2 weeks out, we're just not bringing people out at enough of a pace. The U.S. flew F-18s over Kabul in a show of force to the Taliban, saying, "Don't mess with us or we will bomb you." At the same time, I'm not sure the U.S. wants to, press this button too much with the Taliban, because while the U.S. could drop bombs on the Taliban and, potentially kill a lot of Taliban leadership and members of the Taliban, they would have to kill an awful lot of innocent civilians to do it. And there's a lot of innocent Americans and Afghan citizens who were allied with the U.S. and an awful lot of U.S. troops at the Kabul Airport that would be under extreme danger if any real fighting broke out. So I'm not quite sure this is the route that the U.S. wants to go. And that's something that a lot of HOTS seem just completely unable to reckon with. I'm seeing people like Nikki Haley on Twitter saying that, oh my God, how dare the Biden administration attempt in any way to have any talks with the Taliban? And it's like, listen, lady, we gotta have talks with the Taliban right now because they're the armed force that controls almost all of Afghanistan, except the Kabul airport. And if we want to continue to evacuate these people in this relatively peaceful manner that's happened so far, the only way we're going to do it is by maintaining this contact with the Taliban and not trying to push them around and stick, our thumb in their eye and really show them up and tell them, oh yeah, we're still the boss around here and you're going to take orders from us. They might have different ideas if that's the U.S. tactic approach here. All right, so interesting. We have the son of Ahmed Massoud, his name again, Ahmed Massoud, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post titled "The Mujahideen Resistance to the Taliban Begins Now, but We Need Your Help." This is an appeal for arms, ammo, and supplies from the U.S. to help Massoud and the group that he's bringing together. That includes the former vice president of Afghanistan, Salah, to try to, I guess, fight back against the Taliban. They're starting their resistance from the Panjshir Valley, which is, I guess, a pretty fortified area, and it may be a real problem for the Taliban if they try to go in there and rout these guys or something like that, especially if there's a lot of consolidated anti-Afghan forces. For anybody who's watching the show right now, you can see that the lighter colored area of Afghanistan is the province and the area that's not held by the Taliban, and this is about the area where that light blue triangle is, that this resistance is starting to form. The real threat that I have right now is that the CIA is going to see this as an opportunity. The U.S. is going to see this as an opportunity, and rather trying to let the Afghans work out, find some kind of balance in that country that allows some kind of stability and less fighting, violence, murdering going on. But I'm not exactly optimistic that that's going to happen, especially when we see this kind of stuff being written in the Washington Post. And there's so much concern and people screaming about, oh, China's going to get involved, China's going to get involved. involved. I even saw some guy post on Facebook yesterday, what the U.S. needs to do now is maintain some kind of insurgency in Afghanistan so no other country could have like their hegemony there and control over it. Let the Afghans do what they want. Their lives matter too, and we don't get to foster instability in their country to deliver some kind of minor geopolitical hurdle to Russia and China. Interesting article from U.S. News, or I guess it's from Reuters, reprint here in U.S. News, about how the Taliban claim to have engineered the political collapse of Afghanistan. Now, this is mostly from Taliban sources here, in particular the, I guess, kind of de facto leader of the Taliban right now, Mullah Baradar, and essentially what they put forward is that this didn't happen over a couple of weeks, that over the past few months the Taliban have been making connections and forming ties with low-level military and government officials and also with tribal leaders. And then as they started to make gains, which did happen in this article, according to Mullah Baradar, faster than the Taliban expected, but nonetheless they continued to make these gains, and then of course Ghani left, and so it fell really quick. But they said that the Taliban, weren't really able to, didn't really want to fight a battle, and essentially, just turned a whole bunch of people and went in, and once people realized the Taliban were the more important power faction, they just switched sides. And that's something that happens apparently quite frequently in Afghanistan, and even places where there was expected to be holds out and pockets of resistance in Afghanistan, like Maraza-e Sharif. The city fell very quickly because people changed sides. Now I'm guessing that there's a little bit more violence to all this than the Taliban talked about when they say they made connections with the low-level military and government officials. Well, what happened when their bosses said that they didn't want to go along with this? Maybe they were taken out back and killed by the Taliban, then the lower-level guy became in charge, and the Taliban made a deal with him. But all the same, it's not like you have major battles breaking out across Afghanistan, and this take from the Taliban's perspective of how it happened, I think is very interesting, although I do keep in mind that they're looking to make themselves not look so bad in the Western press. All right, now we need to talk about China. The first story I actually have is related to Afghanistan, where the Chinese foreign minister Yi expressed to Secretary of State Antony Blinken on a phone call Monday that China is willing to work with the U.S. on Afghanistan. He said China is willing to communicate and dialogue with the U.S. to push for a soft landing of the Afghan problem, preventing a new civil war or humanitarian disaster in the country, to avoid it from becoming a breeding ground and shelter for terrorism, and encouraging Afghanistan to set up an inclusive political framework in the line with Afghanistan's situation. Now, a lot of this sounds just like flowery rhetoric, and I think probably so. However, the U.S. and China do carry something of a similar interest in Afghanistan, to the extent that either of these countries have interest in Afghanistan. However, both of these countries are on the surface worried about jihadist threats, and so China with the Uyghurs in Afghanistan, the U.S. with the non-existent Al-Qaeda, but our leaders are worried about Al-Qaeda. This could be something that we could say we'll work on in Afghanistan, or communicate on in Afghanistan, although again I'm not quite sure that there's any real U.S. enemies in the country. Now, talking about China, we now have this ridiculous thing in our ethos, our culture, where you could actually announce your delusion and your mental instability about China, and it somehow actually gets you more credibility on the issue. We had Frank Kendall, who was recently sworn in as the Air Force Secretary, on July 28th, saying, "I've been obsessed, if you will, with China for quite some time now." He says he's obsessed with China. This is the Air Force Secretary. If you are the commander of an entire branch of the military and you're obsessed with anything, and you can maybe say I'm obsessed with rooting out domestic violence or sexual abuse. We know they're not serious about that, but here he's actually serious about being paranoid and obsessed enough. Probably lays in bed all night, staying up thinking about China and how worried he is about China. It's gonna lead the U.S. to making some pretty irrational decisions if this is the state of mind that our leaders. In fact, the pending Secretary of the Navy, Del Toro, said during his confirmation hearing that he would exclusively focus on China if he became the Secretary of the Navy. And it's just kind of these insane statements that, again, are people promoting their delusion and their shortcomings and their xenophobia and hatred for China as it's some kind of like qualification for them to run entire branches of the U.S. military. It's extremely disturbing, and it's going to put us on a path to war. So, this guy who's obviously scared by China because he's obsessed with it, now, it starts to hate China, and so now he wants to scare the Chinese, and his plan to do that is the B-21 bomber. So first, I think this is kind of delusional because the way the U.S. and China work on the nuclear level is both maintain enough of a nuclear triad to inflict enough punishment on the other should kind of any war break out, that it really doesn't make war possible. So who cares if the U.S. has a new B-21? China has nuclear missiles, ground-based missiles, bombers, and a submarine of their own. So, they could inflict enough pain on the U.S. They're not going to be scared by the U.S. bomber. I guess the only thing that they may be worried about is the U.S. is suicidal in their delusions about China, that they would actually wipe out the entire planet just to get back at the CCP. We see this too at the CIA, where the CIA is looking at creating a new spy center to focus only on China. This from Bloomberg, and I think the statement is from Bill Burns, who's the head of the CIA, who wants to create a new mission center for East Asia and the Pacific, or I guess to kind of reclassify the mission center for East Asia and the Pacific and have the mission center for China that would solely focus on China. The director has also said that the U.S. would like to put China specialists all over the world, so all these people in different countries to try to carry out different espionage at and undermine China, which of course will only create tensions. And they're basically turning on the old Cold War hysteria with the Soviet Union and now directing it towards China. I guess they see the American people increasingly uninterested in waging these Middle East wars, worried that their budget is going to be cut, worried that, they may become less important without some evil, monstrous threat that the U.S. people have to be terrified of. They're doing all this fear-mongering against China and creating all these new departments. And for so many American people, I think it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy type of thing where, why would my government do this if China wasn't a threat? They're doing it to ramp up tensions with China and make China a threat. China carried out joint drills with the U.S. This is a direct result of the U.S. hostility towards Russia and China, two countries that really don't have all that big of geopolitical reasons to have any kind of military alliance. We'll have one when the world empire of the U.S. is trying to ring both of those countries with missile defense systems and military bases and nuclear weapons and all this. And so we saw 10,000 Russian and Chinese troops participate in joint exercises in northwestern China. I don't know if this actually does anything from a tactical standpoint for Russia and China. However, it should be in a message to America that the more we are antagonistic towards Russia and China, the more they're willing to set aside their differences and work together against the U.S. Now, the last story I have on China is quite easy, obviously the least important. However, it is kind of telling how all the U.S. acts. So, last week, or I guess actually at the beginning of August, on a United Airlines flight, China claims that 5 of the passengers arrived in China and tested positive. And so to punish United Airlines for this, China gave the United Airlines 3 options on what they could do. One was to have 4 flights operate at 40% capacity, and the other 2 options included canceling 2 flights. So, this seems like a little ridiculous on China's part, but at the same time, the U.S. has talked about doing all kinds of things to punish Americans who don't follow the COVID rules. And so, really, I find it a little hypocritical that the U.S. was mad that China did this. And so, when United Airlines chose to cut 4 flights to 40% passenger service, the U.S. imposed that on for Chinese flights coming to the U.S. I'm sure this is just going to, inconvenience American citizens and travelers who are looking to go to one country from the nets. It won't do anything to combat COVID or anything like that. United said that they were happy with this announcement because they China got punished for their having flown people that had COVID. United should just deal with that and not expect the U.S. government to punish China on their behalf. All right, now let's talk about Israel. Just a few stories here. The Israel carried out strikes in Syria for the first time in nearly a month. 27 days ago was the last time Israel bombed Syria before this past Tuesday. They bombed southern Syria, kind of the area near the Israeli border. There's also reports that Israel carried out some airstrikes, but also dropped leaflets over Syria, warning Syria forces that they'll continue to be casualties in Israeli airstrikes if they continue to associate with Iranian-backed Shia forces. Other things going on. Israel seized a box of chocolate bars bound for Gaza. The Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz announced Monday that Israel had confiscated 23 tons of chocolate bars that were to be imported into the Gaza Strip. Israel officials say they were concerned the attempted acquisition was suspicious. And so those poor Gazans who, for them, chocolate's, a real luxury item, won't even be able to enjoy a little bit of that because Israel just wants to make them suffer, especially the people of Gaza, so they steal even their chocolate. Then I believe a day after or 2 days after, a militant in Gaza fired a rocket at Israel that was intercepted by the Israeli Iron Dome. This all according to Israel. I didn't see any statements from Hamas or any other groups in Gaza, and I didn't see that Israel carried out an airstrike in response to this. Now, Israel has been bombing Gaza pretty regularly since the May 11th ceasefire was agreed to. Israel says this is because Gaza is launching incendiary balloons over the border fence, and Gaza, or the people of Gaza, specifically Hamas, say that they're doing that in response to Israeli not living up their commitments to lift restrictions on things coming out of and going into Gaza. Things like the chocolate bars might be a good example. The U.S. State Department condemned Israeli plans to build 2,200 new settler homes in the West Bank. The U.S. had told Israel to knock off the settlement expansions in the West Bank previously. I'm kind of surprised that they followed through on this condemnation, though, because I believe this plan, Israel originally wanted 3,200 new settler homes. They scaled this back to 2,200, and they also said that they would approve 1,000 new Palestinian homes. Now, not that I think those Palestinian homes will actually end up getting built, but I would thought that that was kind of good enough propaganda to sell the State Department, but we got a condemnation from the State Department anyways. So that was one of the better things to see from Biden's administration on Israel. This last story here on Israel from the Israeli foreign minister, he says he sees no good alternatives to the Iran nuclear deal. Israel's foreign minister is Yair Lapid, and I believe he is the man set to become the prime minister of Israel if there's not new elections or a new, the parliament falls apart and they have a new power sharing agreement come into play in like maybe 14 months or so. He has to go. So this is something positive coming from an Israeli politician, although he says, I am not a supporter of the deal. I think the deal is not right. I've said all along, and I'll say it now, I just don't see a plan B. And so, he's kind of saying that at this point, the deal is better than not having a deal at all. And if that were the position of the Israeli prime minister, that would be a good thing. Unfortunately, there's no way in hell that the JCPOA flounders for the next 14 months or however long it is before Lapid becomes president of Israel, our prime minister of Israel. And in the meantime, I think Joe Biden will go ahead and stick the wooden stake in the heart of the Iran nuclear deal. Now, speaking of Iran, there's a few things going on in that country that I want to talk about. The first is the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Association, released a statement that Iran is now on step 3 of a 4-part plan to produce fuel for the Tehran research reactor. What they did this time is took 257 grams of enriched uranium tetrafluorides and converted it into about 200 grams of uranium metal, and that metal will be used in the future turned into a reactor fuel plate for the Tehran research reactor. Of course, this is the reactor built for the Iranians by the Americans in the 1960s, and it could enrich uranium up to 20%, but this is medical grade. Now, had the U.S. complied with the Iran nuclear deal all along, this likely wouldn't be happening. But since Trump broke the deal and got out of it, this is the situation and what Iran is working on. This is in no way advancing their nuclear weapons program. This is their research reactor. And, I think they make like medicines, radioactive medicines and stuff like that here. But that doesn't stop the U.S. for demanding Iran stop this and claiming that it's an escalation. Of course, the U.S. has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and we don't recognize that our Middle East allies, Israel, has their own massive nuclear arsenal, and Iran's never even had its own nuclear weapons program, and yet the U.S. continues to condemn Iran for anything it does with its civilian nuclear energy program. Last story I have for today, and this is kind of a quick one here. Iran is asking Iraq to expel rebels from the Kurdish border areas. I guess there's a group of Iranian Kurds who are in Iraqi Kurdistan, and Iran wants the Iraqi government to take care of this. I'm not sure if the Iraqi government can. The Iraqi government has been demanding for several years now that Turkey stop carrying out operations in northern Iraq, and they just have no ability to stop them from doing it. Turkey has a military base there. They bombed some clinic and killed 18 people, I believe, this past week in Iraq. And so I'm not sure if the Iraqi government could even do anything about this, if maybe the Iraqi government could pressure some of the Iraqi Kurdish groups to get these guys out of Iraq. But this could be a problem for Iran going forward. I'm not quite sure, but I just want to keep an eye on this story and bring it up because I thought it was pretty interesting to see how the Iraqi government would respond to this request. All right, that's where I have for the show today. I know it's a little bit short today, guys, but it's been a lot of content I've been working on this week. I actually was not only did our 3 shows that we do every week at Conflict of Interest, but was on Liberty Weekly earlier this week. That's Patrick McFarland. And then Tommy Solomon's had me on Year Zero, and I believe that will drop today when this podcast comes out, so keep an eye out for that. Of course, Tommy and Pat are both at the Libertarian Institute, along with myself, Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, and Keith Knight, Hunter DeRennis, Lori Calhoun. We have tons of great content. Connor Freeman all the time on that site. So be sure to check out the Institute, and particularly libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle. And be sure to share the show and donate if you can. Thanks, everyone.